Hello, Man in Gray here. Time for another Man in Gray book review. Today's book is The Last Novel by David Markson, published in 2007 by Counterpoint. It's 202 pages. David Markson was an American novelist who was born in 1927 and who died in 2010. He was known as a novelist, which is a polite way of saying that his books weren't very popular with readers, but they were very popular with other writers. Markson spent most of his life living in Greenwich Village, New York, and he came into contact with a lot of writers and artists in that area, became friends with a lot of the beat writers like Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg. He was also friends with Kurt Vonnegut, a number of other people, and they deeply admired his writing, but none of his books sold very well. And he spent most of his life living in poverty. He was also something of a Luddite. He didn't own a computer, and he kept writing physical letters to people long after everybody else had switched to emails. One little anecdote that kind of illustrates the high esteem he was held in by other writers is a story that Markson tells in one of his letters that he continued to write to people. He became increasingly reclusive as he got older, didn't go out very often, but one year he did attend the Penn Conference. And Penn is a big American writing association, big literary bigwigs, and every year they have a big meeting in New York. And Markson went to this meeting, and Kurt Vonnegut was there, and Vonnegut was mobbed by all of his fanboys. They all wanted pictures with him, and they wanted him to sign his books and everything. And Markson was walking around, nobody's paying attention to him at all, but Vonnegut spotted him. And then he got loose from all of his fanboys and trotted after Markson and said, "Let's go down this hallway where there's nobody so we can talk." And so he went down there. And everybody was just open mouth staring like, what's Vonnegut doing? Who is this guy he's following? But that's an indication of how highly esteemed Markson was among other writers, even if the public at large didn't know anything about him. He started out writing fairly conventional books. His first two novels were thrillers, basically crime noir kind of books set in Greenwich Village. And then he wrote a parody of a Western, which was later made into a movie with Frank Sinatra, Dirty Dingus McGee. But in the 1970s and 80s, he began writing increasingly experimental postmodernist novels, plotless novels that really kind of pushed the boundaries of what was a novel. And this reached the peak in his last four books, which are sometimes grouped and called the note card quartet, because they were written on 3x5 note cards or index cards. He wrote little bits down on these cards, and then he got the lids off shoe boxes and stacked the cards in the tops of these shoe boxes and arranged the cards in the order that he wanted them. And when he got all the cards arranged like he wanted to, he would type all of them up and then submit his novel. So that's not a very conventional way of writing a book as a series of note cards. Of course, nowadays, if you wanted to do something like that, you could do that on a computer much more easily, but he didn't do that. So he wrote his last four novels on note cards, and so they're kind of called the note card quartet. And what makes them odd is that they have no plot, and there's usually only one character, and they're mostly made up of just lists of trivia. And I'm going to read some of them to you here in just a minute. In this book, which is the last of the four books, and it's the last novel that Markson wrote, there's a character in here, his name is simply Novelist, and he's living in a sixth-floor apartment, in a kind of rundown apartment, in a six-story building, and he's very ill, and he's by himself, and he thinks he's dying, and he's almost broke. He's living alone, and he's sad, and he lies in bed, and he thinks about all these bits of trivia that he's learned over the years, and that's basically it. There's a long list of trivia about writers and artists and other things, and then that's interspaced with little stories about, or little sentences or two about the character, the novelist. So let me just read a few little bits of this and give you kind of a flavor of what the novel's like. It's a 200-page book. It starts out with him saying, "Old, tired, sick, alone, and broke." He makes little comments about his life through the novel. But the rest of it is stuff like this. Claude Monet's admission, after standing beside the deathbed of someone he had loved, that in spite of his grief, he had spent much of his time analyzing which pigments comprised the color of her eyelids. So even in death, Monet was fascinated with pigments. Um, let's see, here's one. Let's see here. The so-called anarchist who in 1988 smeared a large X in his own blood on a wall in the Museum of Modern Art and in the process splattered an adjacent Picasso. Okay, let's see, here's another one. Okay, yes. Albert Einstein's only honorary degree from Harvard was apparently organized by a fellow alumnus, Franklin D. Roosevelt. Franklin D. Roosevelt, well into his political career, at least once wrote a book review. And it goes on like that. The novels of Susan Sontag, self-indulgent, overrated crap, the Kevin Costner character calls him in the movie Bull Durham. And he's certainly right about that. So it's just a long list of trivia like that. Every once in a while, there's a little joke or a little parody in here. There's one little passage in which he asked President George W. Bush to write a book review of a recently discovered manuscript by the German philosopher Martin Heidegger, and he says make sure it's at least 12,000 words. Of course, Bush was famous for. George W. Bush famous for, well, I don't say he's famous, but he was once asked what his favorite book was, and he said it was The Very Hungry Caterpillar by Eric Carle, a kid's picture book. Anyway, it's a list of trivia, and again, Markson didn't have a computer, and so he looked all this stuff up in reference books. He had a huge collection of reference books crammed in his apartment, and then sometimes he'd go to the New York Public Library and look up stuff. And somehow he jotted all this stuff down on index cards and arranged it in order. So it really, some people wouldn't consider this a novel at all. It's more like just a book of trivia. But there is a storyline of sorts in here because as you go through here, the trivia increasingly is about death. Painters who died, where they died at, novelists who died, under what conditions they died, what were their dying words. And so you can see that the novelist is increasingly obsessing about his own death as he gets near the end of the road here. So if this sounds like a book you'd be interested in, I've read all four of the note card books, and they are interesting. They certainly aren't conventional by any means, but it's easy to see why these books didn't become bestsellers. But you do learn a lot, right? And I've actually double-checked some of these trivia points to see if Markson was just making them up or if they were real. And every one that I've looked up is checked out to be true. It's factual, so apparently they are. So if you're interested in trivia about artists and writers and stuff, and you're interested in postmodernist fiction, you may want to check out one of David Markson's books, including this one, The Last Novel by David Markson. This has been another Man in Gray book review. Thanks for watching. See you again next time.